It's my great pleasure to welcome to our rainy Bay Area Leif Wenar. Leif is no stranger to the Bay Area. He was actually educated as an undergraduate down the peninsula at Stanford University before he shipped out east, where he studied at Harvard with arguably two of the most important legal and philosophical theorists, period, John Rawls, Robert Nozick. And has worked on a whole manner of issues pertaining to philosophical and quasi-legal approaches to rights and so on. He's published extensively on those issues, and he's currently the chair of the program in philosophy and law at King's College in London. And we're delighted, if I may say so, Leif, to have you here. And we're here because Leif has a wonderful new book, which we're going to be talking about, and he will be talking about Blood Oil, Tyrants, Violence, and the Rules That Run the World. And the book has two big parts to it. One is an analysis, if you like, of our relationship to oil and gas. And the second part is a type of prescriptive approach to what he thinks needs to be done with respect to those relationships that we have with oil. So I'm going to begin with the first part. So let me begin, Leif, with two provocative comments that you make at the beginning. Leif says at the beginning of the book that the oil market, transactions between consumers and producers of oil, he says, is not unlike the slave trade of the 18th century. And secondly, he says that the nature of those current transactions that link oil consumers to producers, he says, you describe, Leif, as being, use the language of oil theft. I wonder if you could just walk us through those two very provocative openings of your book and why you've come to see oil in those terms.
I'd be so glad to. And let me just start by thanking World Affairs for putting this occasion on and say how much I'm glad to be working with Michael, whose work I've learned so much from over the years. It's really an honor. And thank you all very much, too, for being here. I really appreciate your coming out. So oil is the big resource, and it causes a lot of problems. But there's other problems around other resources, and if we're going to start talking about slavery, maybe the easiest way of seeing what's going wrong in resource trade today is just by taking out your smartphone. Now, one thing you think about when you think about your smartphone is that these amazing technological devices are made with natural resources. Every atom was extracted from some exact point on the Earth's surface. But here's another fact about my smartphone, maybe your smartphone. It's completely possible that in this phone there are metals that were extracted at gunpoint by some of the vicious militias in the civil war in the Congo. You may or may not know about the Congo. It's one of the world's worst wars. Deaths there may be reaching Holocaust levels. Even the lowest estimates of combat-related deaths in the Congo, more than all of U.S. combat deaths in all of America's foreign wars combined. Sexual violence is off the scale. This is a seriously bad war, and a lot of it is carried out by rebels extracting the minerals that go into our cell phones and other tech, sending them on through global supply chains to us. Now, here's the mystery. How do I own my phone? How do you own your phone? Under the laws of the United States of America, I own every molecule of this phone free and clear, but how could that be possible? After all, the rebels in the Congo stole those pieces of metal, which now came here, and I own that metal 100% under the laws of this country. All of this is happening because of one very old and very bad law that we take entirely for granted, but which causes a tremendous amount of trouble and which should now change if we can. That law simply says might makes right. Our law, the law of every country for the natural resources of other countries is whoever can seize it by force can sell it to us. Whoever can gain coercive control of a resource-rich territory will buy it from them. Might there makes right here. And if you think about it, that's exactly the same rule that all of our countries used to use, even for human beings. 300 years ago, every country's law for human beings was might makes right. Whoever could seize a person by force, we would buy the person from them. And under that law, 12 million Africans were sent through the gruesome Middle Passage to the Americas, where they were legally bought as property here. So we've overcome might makes right for human beings, and in fact, in many other areas of international affairs. Might makes right for resources is one of the last vestiges of that bad old coercion-based system that puts us into legal business with these bad actors abroad and means that every time we buy a phone or other tech, we may be sending more money to these rebels in other countries, helping them to buy more bullets and more bayonets.
So walk us through then the parallel in oil states and what leads you to the conclusion that transactions with those oil states, I happen to work in Nigeria and Angola, you could be talking about Saudi Arabia or Ecuador perhaps, that led you to conclude that these transactions are forms of theft?
It's something called the oil curse, which you know well. So you've heard that I'm trained in political philosophy, and that just means that I get to look at the big picture. And let me give you the short story of my 10 years of study of the big picture of oil by starting with a quote from one of my fellow philosophers, the former Vice President Dick Cheney. Now, Dick Cheney, in one of his more reflective moments, mused that the problem is that the good Lord did not always decide to put oil in democratic countries. But let's imagine for a second that oil was only in democratic countries. What would our lifetimes have been like if oil was only in democracies? Well, it'd be quite different. There'd be no ISIS, its atrocities. There'd be no Assad with his barrel bombs, no Syrian refugee crisis, probably no 9/11, no Gaddafi, no Saddam, no Iranian sponsorship of terrorism around the world, no Saudi spread of an extreme version of Islam through Asia into Europe, and now even perhaps here, which is now mutating into homegrown terrorism in very scary ways. Oil causes big problems. The biggest threats and crises of our lifetimes are all coming from oil states. And it's the same rule that's making this happen. It's the same rule of might makes right. Whoever can control oil-rich territory by force will buy it from them. So when Saddam took over Iraq in a violent coup, our law said we could buy Iraq's oil from him. And then when ISIS and the Kurds later took over those same wells, the world started buying oil from them. Might makes right. When we say that large legal revenues will go to whoever can control oil by force, we incentivize armed groups to fight for that oil like we see in Syria and Iraq and Libya. And we also empower strongmen to use oil money to buy loyalty and weapons that they need to stay in power, and also to spread their ideologies around the world, as we see with the Saudis, in particular, with their extreme version of Wahhabi Islam.
So are you suggesting then that we as consumers, I don't mean just the United States here, but any European state, any European consumer that in some sense consumes oil indirectly, are you suggesting then that we are ethically and morally complicit with this type of what you're describing as a resource curse and of this principle of might makes right?
Complicit is such a strong word. We can't help it. When you study oil, you come to see how thoroughly enmeshed all of our lives are with oil. And I'm sorry to say it goes a lot beyond just buying gasoline. We do buy blood oil whenever we fill up. There's a big chance that we buy blood oil. But oil is everywhere. Oil is used to make everything that's plastic. If it's plastic, it's oil. If it's synthetic, it's oil. Oil is used to make lipstick, cosmetics, plastic bottles. It may be in your shoes. It may be in your glasses. It may be enhancing your sex life. Oil is everywhere. And that means whenever we go to pay at the pump or even check out in the store or online to pay for ordinary goods, we may unintentionally be sending more of our dollars back to empower violent and oppressive actors abroad. And that violence and oppression so often comes to bite us back.
Is this complicated relationship largely about the relations between governments, the US government, the British government, and their willingness to deal with a Saddam or to deal with a corrupt Angolan authoritarian government? Or, to put it rather differently, where do the oil companies fit into this story?
Yeah, let me talk about the governments first, and then we can talk about the companies. So we spent a lot of time talking about the foreign policy choices that our government makes. But I'm really more interested in this book in the foreign policy choices that we have. So think about the policies that our country has taken towards oil exporting states in the past few years. Should we invade Iraq to unseat Saddam? Should we invade Libya to unseat Gaddafi? Should we invade Syria, which we didn't do, to unseat Assad? Should we take sanctions off of Iran? Our most divisive foreign policy debates have been over the choices our governments make towards oil states. But these are all terrible choices. The dilemmas that we've been facing coming out of these oil states are lose-lose. All of our options are bad. And one reason that we're so divided against each other, even people of goodwill, is that we're arguing over which of the terrible options we should take, and then who's to blame for the disasters that result. I live now in the UK for work. It just breaks my heart to see the United States so divided over having to make these wrenching foreign policy choices. We should try, if we can, to dissolve the bad dilemmas in the first place. We should think about the choices that we have more than the choices that we have to make. We should try to make the choices that we have better by stopping sending our money to the most violent and coercive actors abroad. On the oil companies, I actually find it a rather encouraging story. The more I study, the more I'm encouraged that the oil companies are not going to be an impediment to progress. A lot of people think that the oil companies pull all the strings in Washington and Paris and London, but that's actually not true. Even small, well-organized groups of activists can, if they're savvy and they've got their stuff ready to go, win victories. We were just talking in the green room about that big oil spill in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico. You remember that big BP spill when the platform blew up? For years, small but smart NGOs were trying to get a bill through that would make the oil companies more transparent. Just tell the people of the country how much money you're giving to their government in exchange for their oil. Just make the contracts transparent. No one thought that that bill would ever get passed. Oil is strong. It was introduced in committee at least twice. Oil absolutely kept it coming out of committee. But then the activists had their stuff ready to go, and when the moment of opportunity came, they plugged it in. That summer, I don't know if you remember, 2010, oil was toxic. They couldn't get their phone calls returned in Washington no matter what. At that moment, The activists got their senators to reintroduce the bill, and at 11:59 p.m. on the last day, it was put into the Dodd-Frank Act, and it is now law. And the great inspiring thing about it, when America moved first and required its oil companies to be transparent, Europe immediately passed the same law. And now Europe has very, very strong laws, the same as ours, and all the oil companies are going to have to be more transparent than they were.
Before we shift gears to the prescriptive part, let me just ask you one last question. It's of a more philosophical nature, but I think it's important to your story. You see as central to this understanding of oil and its problems the concept that you refer to as popular sovereignty. I wonder if you could, because it's key to understanding, in a sense, what prescriptively emerges from that. So I wonder if you could just spend a minute just walking us through that notion and why, for you, it's so important in your analysis.
Yeah. So, here's the problem. There's this old bad rule that we're stuck with. Might makes right for resources. Causing a huge amount of trouble overseas, suffering and injustice comes back to hurt us. If we were going to move to a new system, if we could move to a new system, what would the better rule be? Well, here's another great part of this story. At least on paper, at least rhetorically, the whole world has already agreed to a better modern basis for resource trade. The whole world already speaks the language, which is actually America's language. This is one of the most basic principles of American politics. It's just the principle that a country belongs to its people. Abraham Lincoln said it in his first inaugural, the country belongs to its people. But if the country belongs to its people, then the oil is the people's birthright. It's the people, and not power, who should ultimately have control over the natural resources of the country. That's not a partisan principle, that's just an American principle. And in the book, I catalog all sorts of people affirming that principle. So, on one side of the aisle, Senator Bob Graham of Florida said there's a fundamental fact that the oil and gas resources off our coasts are American assets. They belong to the people of the United States of America. And if I can quote George W. Bush from 2006, he said, Iraq's oil belongs to the Iraqi people. It's their asset. It flows very naturally from our lips. The oil belongs to the people. The people get to decide whether it should be privatized or sold to foreigners or just kept in the ground. Luckily, the whole world now speaks that language. As a product of the great struggles for self-determination in the 20th century, almost every country in the world has signed one of the big human rights treaties. And Article 1 of both treaties just says, all peoples may, for their own ends, freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources. And in fact, just a trivia, this is the only human right that's repeated in both covenants. It's the only one stated twice. 98% of the people in the world live in a country that has, on paper, affirmed this principle that the people own the oil. So, switching away from might makes right is a matter of getting the world to walk the walk, given that they already talk the right talk.
But it is also true that, as you lay out in your book, that if you look at the world's major oil states, all of them typically adopt a particular model of exploiting that oil, what you refer to as a state as an agent. And that is, they nationalize the subsurface mineral rights, they establish a statutory monopoly, they establish a huge national oil company, PDVSA in Venezuela, and NNPC in Nigeria, etc. And that becomes then an enormous sort of complex of political power.
Yeah.
And indeed, the so-called national oil companies now are, in terms of their control of reserves and their significance in the oil and gas industry, are enormously significant. So right in the middle of your analysis then are these behemoths, in addition to the big oil companies that you described. So let's put it this way, it's an intimidating and daunting prospect to talk the language of popular resource sovereignty.
It is.
So let me transition then into the second half of your book. And let me just ask you then again to walk us through the first part of that prescription. You say what we need is a clean trade policy. So I wonder if you could just lay out for it and what the elements of such a clean trade policy would be.
The plan is not complicated. The question is whether we can do it. So the rule that's causing us so much trouble, this rule that puts us into business with violent actors abroad, causes us so much trouble, that rule needs to be abolished. And if we can do it, we need to replace it with this idea of popular resource sovereignty, which just means the resources belong to the people. In practical terms, all that really means is the people have to be able to hold their government accountable for resource decisions. Can the people find out what the government is doing with their resources? And if a majority of citizens don't like what the government's doing, can they effectively protest that without fearing their safety or their lives? That's all it means for the government to be accountable to the people. If the government is not accountable to people, if people couldn't possibly be controlling their resources, then anyone who sells off those resources, selling resources that are literally stolen from the people. As in any case of ownership, you need permission from the owner to sell the stuff off. So, in countries where there's no accountability at all, like Saudi, not even minimal, basic, bare bones civil liberties and political rights, the oil that's coming out of those countries is stolen. It's stolen oil. And there's a lot of stolen oil. If you use a common metric for what countries have basic rights and civil liberties, you'll find that over half the traded oil in the world today comes from countries where the governments are not accountable to the people. That's the oil curse, right? So over half the traded oil in the world today is literally stolen. And we shouldn't buy it. By our own principles, we shouldn't buy that oil. So the main part of the clean trade framework is just that we should pass a law so that peacefully and responsibly and gradually we taper off our imports of authoritarian oil and conflict minerals from any country where the people could not possibly be holding their governments to account.
So you might imagine that there would be a host of reactions to that of a more practical sort. One would be, this is going to cost the United States consumer. It's going to cost the U.S. economy at a moment, incidentally, when I don't have to tell you of all people, at a time when oil prices are crashing. Right? What are they now? They're 28 a barrel. Iran is going to be dumping a lot more oil onto the world market. The Saudis are not stopping their desire to dump. Prices will continue to drop, all of which is to say then, one response to your clean trade policy would be, one, it's going to cost us. Secondly might be, how do you determine who is or is not transparent and accountable? Is Angola sort of transparent? But how about Russia? What would be the metrics of establishing, for the purposes of the clean trade policy, who is or is not in that bad category? So let's start with those two, I guess, potential objections, you might say.
Well, the metrics is the easy one, so let me start with that. There's a lot of scales out there that measure civil liberties and political rights. Freedom House has one, The Economist has one, Foreign Policy, and they all tend to come up with the same results. Again, here's the question. You're looking at these countries, resources come out. Can the citizens find out what's happening with their resources? Can they talk to each other about what's happening? Can they protest peacefully if they don't like what's happening? And if a majority strongly oppose what the government is doing with the resources, will the government's policies change in a reasonable time? We've got lots of metrics that will measure that. So let's just take Freedom House, not free countries. Saudi is definitely below the line. Yeah? Algeria, Libya. Lots of countries clearly below the line. Those are the countries we shouldn't buy the oil from. Will it be expensive? Actually, the economic side of this is very encouraging. The economic side will be easy. It's the political side that's going to be hard. So we can switch away from authoritarian oil in a matter of months, and it would be fairly costless. We've got so much oil now in our own country that that transition would be very simple. I was just talking to Nick Butler, who used to be high up in BP. He's the energy correspondent for the Financial Times. And he said the United States, North America, can make this transition almost costlessly. But I'm not telling you that this transition is going to be easy, right? Because it's not. It will mean telling our old Saudi allies, who rules in your country is none of our business, but right now, your regime qualifies for none of our business. We just don't believe we have the right to buy your country's oil from you unless you give your citizens basic civil rights and political liberties. And that's going to be tough. But I'll tell you something, business as usual is going to be expensive too. There is an arc of oil that goes from Russia through the Middle East to Africa, and you can see that that arc of oil is becoming more and more unstable. Green Revolution, Arab Spring, high oil prices, the authoritarians who had oil had enough money to beat the people down and buy them off. My strong view is that the people in these countries are going to get power, one way or another. There's the bad way, and that's if we keep business as usual, we keep sending our money to whoever can be the most violent and repressive. That's just going to fill these countries with more divisive energy. And when the explosions come, we're only going to have these clumsy tools of sanctions and military action to try to contain the damage. That is going to be seriously costly. The next refugee crisis into Europe might be seriously destabilizing, and the next generation of ISIS may be, sending explosive drones through the windows of Congress. That business as usual is going to be expensive. The alternative is for us gradually and responsibly to stand up for our own principles, to say that we stand on the side of the people of those countries as they get power. That stance of ours will empower the reformers that are outside the royal palaces now and very often inside the royal palaces looking for an opportunity to bring about gradual, more progressive change. The people in these countries really are going to get power in the next 5 to 10 years. We should be on their side when that happens instead of on the side of the people who are repressing and attacking them.
Where do you think the oil companies might stand in relationship to a type of clean trade policy? And I say that because in this country, as you know, there's been always, I think historically, I think it's fair to say actually, there's always been a great deal of suspicion going back actually to the early part of the 20th century about what you and I would call big oil. You know, we have a lot of information now that we didn't have 20 years ago about the degree to which some of the large transnational oil companies were centrally involved in the attempting to poo-poo and deny global climate change. We know that there's not a pretty record of sort of alliances between big oil companies and some crooked characters in these oil-producing states, and on and on. So given that, and given this new book, I should probably say that you've probably heard about too, as I have on NPR today by Jane Meyer on the Koch brothers, who have a dollar or two invested in the oil sector. We might, if you put all of these things together, how movable is that behemoth?
Yeah.
That's a difficult,
It's
preposterous
not.
question,
So
I know, but I'm just simply saying that somehow in the center of your book is that behemoth that is not an insignificant actor in relationship to the types of initiatives you're proposing.
So I should just ask, since we're here, is anyone here from oil and gas? Is anyone here from Chevron, which would be the natural? Yeah? Good. So let me say something unsympathetic and let me say something sympathetic. In one mode, you can think that the oil companies are like the slave traders, right? They're just hauling the commodity back and forth. The real problem is not the traders, it's the law that makes it legal to buy slaves, right? It's the same thing. We shouldn't have the right to buy oil from these countries any more than if the Saudis were selling slaves. We should think we should sell them. Okay, so that's the unsympathetic thing. But actually, I think there's a resource curse, an oil curse, not only on the exporting countries because of the oppression and violence, and not only on us because it always ends up spilling over to us whether we try to get involved or not. I think there's actually a curse on the oil companies. So let me ask you, how much money have you made in Iran since 1979? How are you feeling about your investments in Iraq? How's it going since you had to withdraw from Sudan? How are you feeling about Algeria in the long run? Yeah? Syria? These are big oil states. These are places where big oil has not been allowed to make money for all of these years, either because of sanctions or because of serious instability. There's a curse on big oil too. They look, I have to say, they look farther ahead than the US government does just because of the structures of their investments are so long. Taking the long-term view, the real corporate leaders in big oil should see this proposal as being in their long-term interest too, and I would hope that they would support it or at least remain neutral while the rest of us try to get this change through.
Before we turn to your questions, let me just ask you one more question on this more prescriptive side. You end the book with an interesting set of accounts of what you think are the real success stories in and around opening up this largely unaccountable and untransparent sector, particularly on the oil-producing states. I wonder if you could just give the audience a little flavor. Both of us are fans of this organization called Global Witness.
Yeah.
But if you could talk a little bit about those various types of activities that are engaged in parallel to what you're arguing here might be a clean trade policy.
Yeah, thanks. And if you see the cover of the book, you're thinking, wow, that is not the feel-good hit of the summer, right? And it's true, there's lots of shocking stories. But the more I've studied this sector, the more optimistic I am that change really is possible. Maybe you saw that DiCaprio movie, Blood Diamond, remember? That was a fictional representation of real events in Sierra Leone where these terrible rebels, a lot of them child soldiers hyped up on drugs, were amputating villagers to scare them away from the diamond fields. The soldiers were harvesting the diamonds and selling them on to international companies where they ended up in our jewelry, our wedding rings and earrings and so on. It was terrible. And there were these activists who saw the links between our money going in and the empowerment of these terrible rebels in Sierra Leone, and they came up with a clever scheme to stop the trade in blood diamonds, but Sierra Leone was a long way away. This was the late 1990s. We had a lot of other things to think about. The bill never got anywhere. But then they had their stuff ready to go, and their moment of opportunity came. So it happened that these diamonds that those terrible rebels were selling out of Sierra Leone were being sold through to Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda knew that after 9/11, its bank accounts would be frozen and it wouldn't have any cash in the bank anymore. So they needed a store of value, and diamonds are the best store of value. Blood diamonds ended up in the hands of Al-Qaeda after 9/11. That issue became a #1 national security priority for the United States of America. 18 months later, the Clean Diamond Act was passed. America led the ban on blood diamonds, which is now an international regime. Now we can expand that ban on blood diamonds to blood oil. It may seem hard, but how many impossible political changes have happened in our lifetimes, right? End of the Soviet Union, end of apartheid, election of an African American president. How many of us thought that those things were possible? We can do it if we want to do it. That's the message I've really come away with on all this work.
May we turn to some questions, Leif? This first one is really an extension of this and just maybe pushes you a little further. If oil is so prevalent in our everyday purchases in the way that you've described, how do we as consumers make ethical purchasing decisions?
So I'm glad to say that at the end of the week, we will be launching the Clean Trade website. And there's lots of ways that we as citizens and consumers can push this forward. So I've been working with a top consultant in the oil industry, and one thing that we're going to have ready by the end of the week, just getting the numbers, is an index which tells us which oil companies are doing more business with authoritarian regimes. So there'll be a ranking. BP, Shell, Exxon, everyone. Who's doing more of their business with authoritarian regimes? If you're filling up your car, you might choose to go with a company that's doing less business with authoritarians. And if you're making an investment, you might think about investing in companies that are cleaner. That'll send the kind of signals that oil will pay attention to. There's also ways of encouraging our Chinese friends who share these problems with us to stop importing stolen oil. So one thing consumers can do is a boycott, which I call the toycott. You might not think about it, but toys are plastic. They're almost all oil, and it may well be stolen oil, and we shouldn't let our children play with stolen goods. So there's a number of things you can do to get stolen oil out of your purchases. Toys, a lot of cosmetics. There's a washed clean campaign. A lot of those little bottles of soap and shampoo that you get in hotels come from China. That might well be stolen oil. You can tell your hotel not to stock those kinds of goods from China. The citizen campaign is also crucial. I've worked with a team of international lawyers for many years to come up with a declaration on trained and national resources. That's there on the website. It states in precise legal language the principles and the actions that our government should take to get us out of business with these bad actors abroad. So please, if you're interested, at the end of the week, the launch of the site will be there. See a lot of things that we can do to help drive this change.
Just to follow up on that, would it be possible to in some way tag different types of oil given their point of origin? All companies, and I'm sure our friend from Chevron here will acknowledge this, that one can trace back virtually all oil that enters onto the world market to particular wellheads in particular places. So could you tag through the commodities markets, oil traders, different types of bloodiness of oil?
You can.
Could that be done?
It's easiest to do in this country, actually. The United States is incredibly transparent about where the oil comes from, at least when it hits the refineries. So the U.S. government publishes a big spreadsheet, the only government I know of, every month that shows every tanker that comes into every port and where that oil originated. Now, our friends in oil tell us that once that oil gets to the refinery in Richmond, it all gets to mix together, and there's no way of telling which country is providing what at the gas station. I know of one reporter, a guy named Salopek, who worked for the Chicago Tribune, who was allowed, just as a special favor years ago, to know which country the oil came from that went to a particular gas station. But the oil companies were very reluctant to do that. And they're probably not going to do it without some serious pressure. It would be expensive. I'm not saying they're doing it out of bad faith. It would be very expensive for them to do that. We could do that kind of consumer pressure campaign, but when I looked at that looked like it would be too slow and too hard. And that's why I focused instead on who are these guys doing business with? Where are they getting their money upstream? Where are they producing oil? Where are their profits coming from? Actually, the money from gas stations is not that much. Where they get their real money is by taking oil out of the ground. So who's doing more business with authoritarian regimes? That's the pressure point that will encourage countries either to get out of the authoritarian countries or make governance better in the countries where they're invested.
Second question. What impact does the drop in oil prices have on the violence and tyranny that exists at the beginning of the supply chain? I was just, some of you probably heard this, I was just listening to a story on the radio before I came about the declining oil prices and how they're likely to continue to decline. I think there's a fighting chance they'll go below 20 a barrel. But the point of this story was things are so bad, and there is so much oil, as you know, stored around the world, often in tankers. Iran has armies, if that's the right metaphor, of tankers just holding oil. But the point of this story was just simply to say that oil prices are so low now that local oil producers on the Bakken field in the Dakotas are actually paying wholesalers, paying them to take oil off their hands.
Wow.
So that's a measure of the oil price crisis. And of course, the oil industry is in the midst of a major, if not shakeout. There are certainly smaller independents are going out of business, but this is, for those of us who are gray hairs, this is the 1980s all over again. So the question here is, if I could just expand it a little bit, Leif, what's that, if you see it as a type of crisis or a type of restructuring of the oil industry, and particularly this downward pressure on prices, is this good or bad news for your story?
So I just, once again, say how much I've learned from Michael. And over years, he's been writing just the most brilliant work on violence surrounding oil. Just terrific stuff at all levels. And the low oil price is really hurting a country that we both care a lot about, which is Nigeria. Nigeria is finally, after a long time, starting to get better. They've got a better government, and the low oil price is going to make progress harder in Nigeria, which is just a vital country for Africa and for the world. So it's bad in some places which are trying to get better, but it's going to make it a lot harder for the real petrocrats to hold on in the Middle East. And you can see that already. I mean, this Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran is heating up. They really are getting at each other. They've been fighting proxy wars in the region, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, maybe Libya. Now you can see them getting more desperate as the money starts to run out. Saudi Arabia announced, who knows whether, they've announced that they're going to put their national oil company up for an IPO. They really seem to need the money. They also need legitimation. They need to distract their people over the cuts that are coming. And that's why we see both Saudi and Iran stirring up religious hatreds, stirring up these sectarian tensions in the region. And that's a really, really dangerous game to play. The low price of oil is going to make it harder for those guys to hang on. It's going to make it easier for the people to resist them. And like I say, we should take a stand with the people now instead of being in cahoots with the people who are oppressing them.
Two questions coming at the same issue from slightly different directions, Leif. One is, how effective as an organization is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative? And secondly, again from a different direction but the same focus in a sense, what are the implications of the recent climate change agreement in Paris, and more generally the political push in and around carbon emissions? How is that likely to affect the shift to a type of clean trade policy?
Yeah. So I don't know if you know about the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. It's one of the big transparency initiatives in the sector, and it's another one of these things that no one ever thought would happen, and then it did. There's been a lot of effort on transparency. If you look at all of the initiatives in this sector that we've been studying for 30 years, unconsciously, they've all got one common element. All the brilliant activists who've been pushing all these different schemes have unintentionally converged on a common element. All of these initiatives try to get more power to the people over their resources. So transparency, get more information to the people about what's happening to their resources so they can understand what to do to control them better. Good. The blood diamonds thing, the Kimberley process. Get the resources out of the hands of the rebels and into government control so that people could possibly have some control. A lot of people are really in favor of this idea that's called oil to cash. So instead of the government just getting all of the money for the oil, and using the money for coercion, violence. How about the government distributes that oil money equally to all citizens, and then the government has to tax the money away from the citizens and be responsive to their desires? A lot of people are in favor. All of these initiatives, one way or another, anti-corruption, trying to get more power to the people over their resources, and as you can tell, that's the approach I think we should take in a principled way on a much larger scale. So transparency is a part of a big effort to get more power to the people of those countries.
Climate change.
You remember in the news coming out of Paris this fall, there were two big stories. One was the big climate conference, and the other were the terrible attacks on the people in the cafes and the stadiums. We've got to do something about climate, and we've got to do something about blood oil. Climate change, violent extremism, instability, these problems are problems we have to tackle at once. Luckily, one big way of decarbonizing the energy supply is to stop buying blood oil. Remember what I said. On our own principles, half the world's traded oil right now is stolen. It's not available legally to be sold, even on basic market principles. If we really thought that half of the world's oil could not legally be brought, that would be a great incentive to go on to a authoritarians to alternatives plan. We can do both of these things at once. The two campaigns can help each other.
A related question from Steve. If we agree with your philosophical premises and ethical commitments, why could we not agree to Keystone, the Keystone Pipeline, from a democratic country like Canada? Why do we prefer to buy from tyranny? So I guess that's a question about whether...
Yeah, that's right.
You know,
That's a related question. Climate, very important. If we don't do something about climate, the future is going to be quite bad. Instability and extremism coming out of oil-producing regions, that's a real problem. If we don't do something about that, the future is going to be quite bad. We got to solve both of these problems at once. And as I say, the campaigns can go together. People in climate, if people who work on climate here, they've been very enthusiastic about something called stranded assets, right? These big reports come out saying, look, we just shouldn't be using all the oil that we've even discovered already. These assets should be stranded. Now to activists, that's a powerful idea, but to anyone with a market perspective, any big player in the market, it sounds a bit perverse to say that assets should be stranded, they shouldn't be used. It sounds almost obscene. But if you listen to this argument, by our own basic principles, oil belongs to the people. Those assets are stranded because they can't legally be sold. They're stranded on basic market principles because to take them out of the ground the way they are now is to steal them. The assets are stranded because those regimes can't legally sell them according to our most basic beliefs. So the two campaigns can go together, both philosophically and strategically.
This question says, if diamonds and oil, or although we could add other resources too, you mentioned coltan, are associated with authoritarian regimes, but if authoritarian regimes are adaptable, would not cleaning up the oil trade just promote them, push them toward doing something else? I presume something else, he or she means here, something equally problematic. I guess that's an argument we've heard for a long, long time about embargoes and sanctions in general.
Yeah.
How do you know that embargoes and sanctions have the type of progressive consequences that one wishes?
There's something particularly bad about oil. I'm just going to say this, and there's a reason for that. There's an oil curse because oil is an extremely valuable commodity, and the way we're running the world now, whoever can control just a few holes in the ground by force will get all the money for that commodity, right? Oil is the largest source of unaccountable power in the world. All you need to do is to control the well by force. Get some soldiers, put up a fence, and you get this tremendous amount of power. And it's totally unaccountable. The people of the country have to watch while their natural wealth is sold off. There's nothing they can do about it. The money goes straight to the top. And if the regime wants to buy more security forces, more spies, more guns, more guards, or just buy the people off, they can do that. The only tools we have to try to check the unaccountable power of authoritarians and armed group are sanctions and military action. But as we've seen for Iraq and Iran, Libya, and now ISIS, sanctions and military actions are clumsy tools. They often don't work very well, they're expensive, and they have a lot of unintended consequences. So we've got to try to make oil accountable in the only real way it can be, accountable to the people who live right there on the ground. They're the people who should be taking control over the resources of the country.
Here's a question on this tricky issue of geopolitics and national interest. The Saudi Arabian government is more than just an oil seller to the United States in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia serves, as an important U.S. ally at controlling Iran, one, and two, monitoring the situation in Syria. U.S. has no alternative ally in the region, and if we refuse to accept Sorry, let me run that by you again. The U.S. has no alternative ally in the region if we refuse to accept the despotic regime of Saudi Arabia. If the U.S. commits to your clean trade policy, how can U.S. national interests in the Middle East be maintained?
That's the hard part. That's the good question, right? I mean, they have been our allies for a long time. Since 1944. When FDR met the founding Saudi king at the Great Bitter Lake and said, our countries will go together through this. Through thick and thin, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have shared a lot of their policies. Now, relations are tense. You can tell the Saudis really don't like what's going on. They didn't like that we let Mubarak go in Egypt. They thought we should have stood up for Mubarak. They really didn't like when we made this nuclear deal with Iran. There's two things that really bind us with the Saudis now, and it's not oil anymore. We don't need their oil. One is they buy a lot of stuff from us, especially in the defense industries, but not only in defense industries. Saudi Arabian money really does mean more jobs in Los Angeles and St. Louis. That's really true. A couple years ago, Saudi Arabia spent almost 20% of its official budget buying weapons from America. That's much bigger percentage than we spend on the whole Defense Department. So they buy a lot of stuff from us. And when you talk to serious people in the government, they say, we share a lot of intelligence on terrorism with the Saudis. The Saudis are crucial for sharing intelligence. And that's probably true. But from the long-term perspective, we're sharing intelligence against threats that one way or another, the Saudi regime itself was instrumental in creating. Let me just say this again. People don't talk about this a lot, but it's really true. One of the biggest ideological campaigns in history has been the Saudis spending tens of billions of dollars spreading their own intolerant, and I have to say anti-Western, version of Islam around the world by funding schools and study centers and mosques, and spreading this version of Islam, which is not only anti-Christian and anti-Jewish, but against all Muslims who are not Wahhabi or Salafists. That ideological campaign is one reason that we see this strange phenomenon of jihadi Salafism springing up in all of these countries seemingly spontaneously. So there are these security threats, but one reason that there are these security threats is for decades our money, paid at the pump, has been going to fund this regime who has seen its legitimation as furthered by imprinting this very intolerant version of Islam on its own people and spreading it aggressively around the world. We should think carefully about our relations with that regime.
It's a related question. It's always been U.S. policy to subvert democratic movements, Iran, 53, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Indonesia, etc. What can we do to actually help promote democracy, actual policy, and not the iron-fisted dictatorships that we currently support?
Yeah.
I guess that's posing a question in part about the degree to which, again, a type of trade-driven policy with ethical considerations of the sort you're describing need to be complemented by something else if there's a real prospect of the type of democratic shifts that you're interested in.
That's a great question. Whoever asked that question, I feel with you. San Francisco is a very worldly place. You guys probably travel the world as I do. When you travel the world, you find, as I do, that foreigners tend to love Americans, but honestly, they don't trust our government. They really don't. Whatever our government says, they take the opposite. Let me just give you one stat from the book. Even in a non-Arab ally of the United States, Turkey, only 20% of people polled believed that Arabs were behind 9/11. And when someone at Princeton did a study of the Arab Twitter feeds around the Boston Marathon bombings, remember that? 2-1. Arabs were more likely to tweet that the US government was behind the bombings than they were to express sympathy for the victims. We need trust more than we need any military buildup. I mean, if Jesus Christ himself were to come and say he was going to bring peace to the world, a lot of people would spin it as an American plot. The way to build trust is to act on your principles and bear cost for your principles. That's how trust builds in interpersonal relationships. If we finally say that we stand on the side of the people and we believe that they should be controlling their countries and we're not going to buy oil from anyone who's selling it without the people's assent, that's the kind of thing that will build trust. And like I say, we need trust so much. With more trust, we can solve more of these international problems that bedevil us so much, like climate change.
I think we have time for one more question, Leif, so this is perhaps the appropriate one. Do you think that 100 years from now, people will be thinking, quote, given all the human, political, and environmental costs of using oil, why the hell didn't those idiots invest in renewable energy long before they did? Have we grown so myopic about our choices that we can't see how they'll look in the long run?
That's so true. Thank you so much for that question. There's a part in the book where it says that the people after us will look back when we propelled ourselves around the planet by burning mud and wonder. But let me give you one last view, long view, big picture about why I'm so encouraged that this change can happen. And it goes right back to the beginning, the first thing we talked about. Think again about the slave trade. Might makes right for people. Whoever can seize it by force can sell it to us. Back then, 300 years ago, not only with the slave trade, all dimensions of international affairs were governed by the same bad old law of might makes right. So the slave trade, that's one entrance. But also, if one country could capture the land of another country militarily, they got the internationally recognized legal right to rule that land, might made right. If one country could gain control over a foreign people by force, they got the legal right to rule that people as a colony. Might made right. And even within a country, back then, whoever could gain the most power had almost unlimited rights to do whatever they wanted to the people. So the sovereign could install a racist apartheid government. The sovereign could engage in ethnic cleansing, even genocide. Back then, all of these things were perfectly legal because the law for everything was might makes right. But look, we have overcome all of those instances of might makes right in our history. The slave trade, territorial conquest, colonialism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide. All of those things are now illegal. And those steps forward are some of the greatest steps towards progress and the rule of law in human history. Might Makes Right for Resources is one of the last vestiges of that bad old coercion-based system. And we can overcome it once more by getting out of business with the men of blood abroad and saying that we will no longer buy stolen natural resources.
I think we're close to time, so please join with me in thanking Leif for a wonderful conversation, and he'll be around signing books for those of you that are interested. Thank you, Leif.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure.